Well, thank you so much, Johannes, and I want to thank the other organizers as well for putting this together. It's been a fantastic morning. Every single talk so far was worth coming out here, was worth the trip, so thank you. I am a vision scientist in my day job, so I'd like to show you this. And if you've never seen this, please just fixate on that black cross in the middle of the screen. And if you don't move your eyes and keep doing it, what you should see is a green dot that all of a sudden appears. And as you keep looking right in the middle, the magenta dots, they tend to fade from view. So I like to show that my undergraduate students and show them that you do not need to take drugs to hallucinate. So the green dot is not really there. If you move your eyes, you can see that all that is actually happening on the screen is one of the dots is removed at a time. So this is a good demonstration, I think, of what vision scientists think of when we think of consciousness, that there's a discoupling from reality in a way that you can sometimes consciously perceive things that are not really there, you hallucinate, or you fail to perceive things that are really there, in this case of these other magenta dots. And so illusions such as this were instrumental in forging a paradigm that we've already heard about this morning about searching neural correlates of consciousness. So Christoph Koch and the late Francis Crick, they made this proposal that neurophysiologists, we can stick electrodes in the brain and then we can find neurons. And some of these neurons, they should represent what is actually happening in the world because the eye represents stimuli veridically, as we say, truthfully. And then we should find some neurons that represent what is happening in your perception, your consciousness, as these illusions happen. And so that was a very fruitful paradigm, very successful. And you can see here, it's very similar data that Lucia showed this morning with the publications over time. And so 102 in this peak were also contributed by my group. But you can see this peak is over. So there seems to be a decline in publications on PubMed that talk about neurocorrelate. And I think it's because Lucia gave away the dirty secret in the family, the dirty dishes. There are problems with the approach, and we're a little bit stuck in that problems with the paradigms. There's another problem, which is that if we take neural activation and we correlate it with consciousness, all we end up is getting a statistical relationship. And so that doesn't get us very far in science. Usually that's not what we do in science, that's not where it ends in science. What we usually do in science is that we try to get mathematical laws of nature, if you will, that tie one phenomenon to another. So what a neurophysiologist like me is dreaming of is that we come up with a mapping that allows us to take neural data and throw it into mathematical constructs. This could be equations, this could be other morphisms, this could be functors, some kind of way that allows us to map the neural data onto something that turns out to be consciousness. And I just want to refer here to Johannes' great paper that makes an excellent point that this should be possible using the mathematical tools that we have. Now, what I put up here is a function or a set of equations because I think if we look at the history of science, there's a good reason to believe that in the end we might find equations. Because most of the phenomena that we have, we feel to most of our satisfaction tackled in science, they end up with very simple equations. Why that is another big philosophical, maybe even theological question, but it is something that we happen to find again and again and again. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that finding a mathematical solution to a scientific problem seems to be very satisfying. Now, just to go a little bit further, what somebody like me who's dealing with a lot of neural data is dealing with, there's basically a bunch of desirable traits that I would like to have a scientific theory of consciousness to have. The first one, it shouldn't contradict itself. Maybe that's a given. Second one, maybe that's a little bit more controversial. It should be parsimonious. So it should obey Occam's razor. We shouldn't make too many superfluous assumptions. But here are the really interesting points. As I just said, ideally, it's mathematically formalized. It's translated into the language of mathematics because, as Galileo said, that's what the book of nature is written in. We'd like it to be falsifiable, or if you're not a Popperian, at least we would like it to have vulnerabilities, ways that we can test it and destroy it, ways that we can show that if we don't destroy it, if we're not a Popperian, we've got a Bayesian, in the Bayesian way, reduce the likelihood of the likeliness of a theory. And this is where I think most of the existing theories fall apart. We would like to have a mapping between brain activity and not just the level of how much a system is conscious, but also the contents, the actual qualia, the actual experience that a conscious system has. And so most of the theories that I'm familiar with, that is where they fall apart. Excuse me. And then lastly, and this is what my talk will be about, there should be empirical support. So it's nice to have these theories, but in the end, we want to go out in the real world and see how well these theories perform. And so I'm going to, we heard this morning about this great effort to compare different theories, but I'm going to speak now about the elephant in the room, which is that there's a reason that there's a theory that's predominating this meeting in particular. I think that there's only one theory, at least to my knowledge, who really checks all the check marks of what I just put up in the slide, and that's integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi. And so I put the equations on here. There's other ways to work with the theory, and there's also a lot of empirical support already for this theory, and some studies that give the theory a hard time. Now the early, I'm not going to talk about all of these studies, I'm just going to give you a broad overview and then talk about some data that is bleeding edge, if you will. So some of the earliest tests of integrated information theory were indirect. And so those were the famous SAP and ZIP experiments. So people basically were contrasted between in an awake state and a sleep state. And electric activity was measured off the scalp, EEG, an electroencephalogram. And then the brain was disrupted with electromagnetic pulse, a TMS pulse. And the prediction of the theory was that the brain should respond differently in a conscious state versus an unconscious state. And that is exactly what was shown. Now, this doesn't do what I just said, which is you take the equations, you take the brain activity, you put them in the equations and see what comes out. And that is what is possible since the latest iteration of integrated information theory, integrated information 3.0. And it was done the first time, to my knowledge, last year in this study from a group from Australia by Leung. And they used data that was collected in fruit flies. In particular, they put microelectrodes in the brain equivalent that fruit flies have and collected neural data and had the fruit flies either be awake or anesthetized, or at least, I should say, they were exposed to the drugs that cause anesthesia in humans. And what they did is they used this neural data and they applied all of these equations. And so this right here is a diagram of how this works out in practice. Now, the exciting part when I read the paper was that you do not have to do all of this yourself. So Giulio's lab put out Python code that's freely open source, available on GitHub, PyPy, and that allows you to take neural data, you could do it yourself, and basically do all of these computations using these equations. And so what they found, lo and behold, using that study, is that the theory held. So what you see right here is a diagram, and in red, you see the distribution of data when the fruit flies were in a normal awake state, and in blue, you see the data when the fruit flies were exposed to an anesthetic agent. And the theory says that a conscious system should have a higher phi, higher integrated information, than an unconscious system, and you can see this shift in the data showing this exactly. Now, when I showed these data, my colleagues said, well, but that's a fruit fly. And so my colleagues work with bigger mammals, for example, non-human primates. And so, of course, the next question would be, does this hold if you're trying to use these data on bigger animals? So one thing that's interesting in these bigger animals that fruit flies don't have is, for example, the structure of the brain is totally different. And I'm showing you right here a histological slice of a primate brain. And you can see that our brain is highly organized. It has these columns. All these neurons that sit right underneath each other. And it is interesting because there's a lot of theories that say that these columns might be computational units. They might be special. If we understand one column, it might be easy to understand the rest of the brain. So one idea to use mammals to study integrated information theory on actual neural data is, and so I've taken this paper here by Pedro and colleagues, would be to collect data for neural columns, then apply PyPy, or these equations from integrated information theory, and see if the results hold or don't hold. And so there's one study that I would like to introduce you to in particular. So the diagram above, I'm not going to bother you with all of the details, but that is for the neurophysiologists among you to prove you that we were able to get neural data from the different layers of different columns of cortex in different subjects. And We did all of the rigorous experiments and analyses to make sure that's the case. And what you see below is more interesting. This is diagrams of a screen that was shown to the animals. And the animals had to keep the eyes steady, they had to fixate for a certain amount of time. There was nothing shown on the screen. And then we just showed green dots and one red dot. And so whenever you do that, what happens is that your attention gets automatically drawn to the oddball, to the red dot, because it sticks out. So we call that saliency. And so then the animal had to make an eye movement towards the oddball, towards the red dot, and that was it. That yielded positive reward. And so sometimes the animals make mistakes, so you can kind of track attention, can see what happens. So obviously these data were not collected to study consciousness. These data were collected in the context of other experiments. And so my first instinct was, well, let's just use these data, throw them in PyPy, and see what happens. And I did not get my hopes up very much. But so just to give you an idea, what you see here is the neural response, and it's averaged across a lot of neurons. And you see in red and in blue the two conditions. So right here at the left-hand side of the data, this is where the animals just look at the screen, and you see the neurons are not very responsive as a function of time because nothing happens. There's no visual stimulus, it's just a gray screen. And then you can see both the red and the blue traces shoot up. And that's because we turned on this array of stimuli. And so in one case, the animal correctly detected the oddball and paid attention to the red stimulus, so we call this the attended condition. And in the other condition, in the red condition, the animal did not pay attention. And so this is a very typical, commonly used experiment in vision science. So the question was, how does phi go with these kind of data? So the first thing was to compute phi for the spacetime when nothing is happening on the screen and phi wasn't very high. And then to do a repetition, see if time goes on, does phi change? And it does not. And phi does go up though, at the moment that a stimulus is shown on the screen. So that was exciting because phi, ultimately, if you really want to get the consciousness, should be computed across the whole brain. And so we are just picking a bunch of neurons in one column and you still see that the integrated information goes up. Now, what happens if the animal pays attention? Well, phi goes even higher. So you could imagine that as you pay attention, your consciousness gets richer, you're more focused, and indeed, phi goes up. Well, the interesting test, of course, is now what happens if the animal doesn't pay attention? Well, you could argue in this case, phi should even be lower than the baseline, because attention is sucked up elsewhere. And so this stimulus that we're now looking at that is not in the focus of attention of the animal might not even enter conscious awareness. And indeed, that's what we found. So phi was lower in this case. So this was very exciting to us, to just take random data, take a theory that wasn't designed for these data, just try it out, good on testing, and it held up. Now you might say, well, that's just a bunch of neurons in the brain. What about other models? What about humans? So let me introduce you to my colleague at Vanderbilt, Katie Chang. Katie is really interested in tracking arousal with fMRI. That's for two reasons. One is that we really struggle to find out how aroused or vigilant people are in general. And the other reason is that the arousal tends to go up and down with people over time. So right now, you're probably a little less aroused than you were when I started giving my talk. And that causes a problem if you do fMRI. It changes the brain data that you're interested in. So what Katie is interested in is trying to find a way to regress the arousal out of the data to get purer fMRI data. And so she published some papers. And so what you see right here is different traces of doing this. And so she confirms arousal by using EEG. That's the gold standard. That's what anesthesiologists tend to do. That's how we can find out if a person is aroused, more or less conscious. And you can see in these data that the arousal drops. Now the interesting thing was Katie published these data because her fMRI template that she uses to detect arousal is basically the best on the market, as we say. And so introducing her to integrated information theory, she was eager to give that a try and see if that gets close to what the fMRI template does. And it turns out it does way better. So as we started looking at integrated information theory and using human fMRI data, it gave us a much better temporal resolution to track arousal than the conventional technique that she has done before. So I hope you saw why people like me are excited about this theory. So we took it off the shelves and we're using it to all of these different kinds of data, and so far it always seems to hold. And so as I said, if you're curious into this, all of these analyses were done using Google Collab, which is basically a Python Jupyter notebook that's publicly available. And you're very welcome to go on there and try this yourself using our data or data of your own. So to summarize, so brain activity can be mathematically described. Levels and consciousness can be mathematically described. And IIT provides a way to map between these mathematical constructs. And we find that this works across species, from fruit flies all the way to humans, both qualitatively as well as quantitatively, which is really exciting. And so, of course, data like these are hard to get. So these are all the people in my lab, funding support, and other people from Julia's lab, and now to Gia's lab have been very influential and helpful to do this work. Thank you very much.